All right, here's an odd question to sit with for a second. We drink milk from cows. We drink milk from goats. And plenty of people drink milk from sheep. Humans have even worked out how to milk camels, yaks, water buffalo, and reindeer. So, why not pigs? Pigs are mammals. They make milk. That milk contains fat, protein, sugar, essentially everything you'd expect to find in milk from any mammal. So, what's actually holding us back? Why did humans take one look at a cow and decide, yes, we're milking that? Then take one look at a pig and decide, absolutely not. And the reason has almost nothing to do with whether pig milk is safe to drink. It has everything to do with the animal itself. Pigs absolutely do produce milk, and in respectable quantities at that. A mother pig, called a sow, generates a genuinely surprising volume for her piglets across a single nursing cycle, easily enough to satisfy a hungry, growing litter. But there's one enormous obstacle standing between that milk and your refrigerator. You can't easily get it out of her. That might sound like a minor inconvenience. It isn't. Think about how a cow is built. A cow carries one large udder with four teats that sit conveniently within reach. You can stand beside her, attach a milking machine, and draw out liters in a matter of minutes. A sow is built in a completely different way, almost as if evolution had a different animal entirely in mind. Rather than one central udder, she has somewhere between 12 and 14 individual mammary glands arranged in two long rows running down her belly, each one equipped with its own small, independent teat. Instead of one single accessible storage tank, she has more than a dozen separate outlets scattered across the entire length of her underside. And here's the part that really matters, the part that explains almost everything else in this story. That milk isn't just sitting there in some passive reservoir, waiting patiently for someone to come along and collect it. Piglets trigger the release themselves through vigorous nursing, stimulating the teat and setting off a hormonal reflex that causes the sow to eject milk in short, synchronized bursts, typically lasting somewhere around 15 to 20 seconds at a time, spaced roughly 45 minutes to an hour apart. The entire system is built around one very specific scenario: an entire litter of hungry piglets attacking every teat simultaneously. The instant that window opens, not a single human standing patiently beside her with a bucket. Each piglet claims a particular teat and defends it, establishing what researchers who study pig behavior call a fixed nursing order. And the whole herd nurses together in a tight, synchronized burst that's over almost as quickly as it began. For a farmer hoping to collect milk by hand or machine, that timing is a genuine nightmare. You'd need to catch a 15-second window that fires unpredictably from more than a dozen small outlets at once on an animal that isn't cooperating. Compare that to a dairy cow whose milk ejection reflex, once triggered, keeps the udder flowing steadily for several minutes at a stretch. Plenty of time to attach equipment, position a bucket, or simply sit down and get to work. A sow gives you a blink, and then the window slams shut until the next nursing cycle rolls around roughly an hour later. Even veterinary researchers who study swine lactation describe the letdown as almost comically brief compared with cattle, sheep, or goats, all of which sustain milk flow long enough to make manual or mechanical collection genuinely practical. If discovering that your morning bacon's mother runs on a 15-second dairy schedule surprised you, stick around, because the story only gets stranger from here. And if you enjoy this kind of dig into the strange biology hiding behind everyday food, go ahead and subscribe now. Even if you solved the timing problem, you'd still run into quantity. A modern dairy cow, a Holstein specifically, can produce somewhere in the neighborhood of 9,000 liters of milk across a single, roughly 10-month lactation, far more than any single calf could possibly drink, and that number has climbed steadily over the past century as breeders selected specifically for higher output. That enormous surplus exists because humans have spent centuries selectively breeding cattle specifically to overproduce milk relative to what their calves actually need, generation after generation, chasing yield the way a car manufacturer might chase fuel efficiency. That extra volume is exactly what humans learned to collect and turn into a viable industry. Pigs never got bred that way, because there was never an economic reason to start down that path in the first place. A sow's total daily output, spread across her entire litter, typically comes to somewhere around 8 to 10 liters at peak lactation. A genuinely respectable figure on paper, and pig litters are large, frequently 10 or more piglets at once, sometimes reaching well beyond that in modern commercial breeds. Those piglets are remarkably efficient at consuming essentially everything their mother produces in real time, competing aggressively for access the moment each brief letdown begins. There's no meaningful surplus left over waiting for a human to intercept, and that single difference changes the entire economic calculation from the ground up. So, why did cows become the default dairy animal in the first place? Because cows happen to check nearly every box the job requires. They're large, relatively calm, capable of living on grass and other cheap fibrous plants, easy to manage in herds, and their udders sit right there in the open, practically advertising themselves. They produce enormous volumes of milk, and critically, you don't have to kill a cow to get any of it. You can milk the same animal daily for months, breed her again, and keep the cycle running indefinitely. That's an extraordinary economic arrangement, a renewable food source from a single animal that keeps paying dividends year after year without ever requiring a trip to the butcher. Now try applying that same model to pigs. Pigs are intelligent, strong, fast, and not remotely interested in cooperating with a human's morning milking routine. A large sow guarding a fresh litter can become genuinely dangerous if she feels threatened or stressed, capable of inflicting serious injury on anyone she perceives as a threat to her piglets, which makes the idea of a farmer crouching beside her twice a day considerably less appealing than it sounds on paper. And even a successful collection effort, assuming you somehow solved both the timing problem and the safety problem, would still leave you with a fraction of what a dairy cow hands over willingly and without complaint. So the farmer, historically, asked a simple question: why bother? And humans have always been remarkably good at answering that particular question honestly. We don't just ask whether something can be eaten or extracted. We ask whether it can be produced cheaply, safely, and reliably at real scale, generation after generation, without constant risk to the person doing the collecting. That's exactly where pigs lose the argument, decisively and on nearly every measurable front. There's another layer to this worth digging into, because pig milk itself is genuinely different in composition, not merely harder to access. Milk composition varies significantly across species, shaped almost entirely by how quickly that species' offspring need to grow and how vulnerable they are in the meantime. Pig milk runs notably rich in fat and protein, since piglets are under intense biological pressure to grow fast, often doubling their birth weight within roughly a week and reaching several times their birth weight within a single month. Compare that to a human infant, which typically takes around 4 to 6 months to double its birth weight, or even a calf, which grows at a comparatively leisurely pace next to a piglet. Their mother's milk is essentially formulated for rapid-fire growth rather than gradual, steady development. Packed with the concentrated fat and protein a fragile newborn piglet needs to survive a harsh, competitive nursing environment and reach a safer body size as quickly as biologically possible. None of that makes pig milk unsafe or unpalatable for a human to drink in principle. Small-scale taste tests conducted out of pure curiosity, rather than any serious agricultural interest, describe it as noticeably sweeter and richer than cow milk, closer in feel to heavy cream. It simply makes pig milk a different product entirely, engineered by evolution for a completely different purpose than the milk humans happen to grow accustomed to drinking over thousands of years. It's worth pausing here on something important. Humans didn't start drinking cow milk because cow milk happened to be biologically tailored for the human body. Plenty of adult humans, in fact, struggle to digest lactose at all. And researchers estimate that a majority of adults worldwide have at least some degree of reduced lactase production once they pass early childhood. We drink cow milk anyway, not because our bodies were designed for it, but because humans developed the technology, patience, and cultural infrastructure needed to exploit cattle specifically, and because certain populations, particularly across parts of Europe and East Africa, independently evolved genetic mutations allowing lactase production to continue into adulthood, a trait geneticists sometimes call lactase persistence. Thousands of years of selective breeding and animal husbandry slowly converted milk from a private resource meant exclusively for calves into a widely traded human commodity. And once that entire system existed, industries grew up around it almost automatically. Cheese, butter, yogurt, cream, powdered milk, whey protein, an enormous, self-reinforcing economic structure employing millions of people and moving billions of dollars annually. Once an industry reaches that scale, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for a completely different animal to muscle its way in and compete on cost, infrastructure, or consumer familiarity. Imagine trying to build a global pig dairy industry entirely from scratch today. You'd need specially bred sows selected over many generations purely for milk yield, custom milking equipment engineered for a dozen tiny, fast firing teats instead of one accessible udder, entirely new handling systems built around an animal that can turn aggressive without warning, dedicated processing facilities, and a completely new set of consumer habits and recipes built from nothing. And even after all of that investment, you'd still be competing directly against an existing cattle industry already producing colossal volumes efficiently, with centuries of infrastructure and consumer trust already in place. There's simply no compelling reason to make that switch, economically or otherwise. Here's where the history actually gets more interesting than the sample story usually lets on. Humans experimented widely with milk producing animals across different regions and eras: cattle, goats, sheep, camels, water buffalo, yaks, horses, reindeer, even donkeys. And some cultures milked animals well outside that familiar list under specific local conditions. Donkey milk in particular has a long, well-documented history stretching back to ancient Rome, where it was prized for its unusually close chemical resemblance to human breast milk and its relatively low fat content, and it remains a small but real commercial product in parts of Europe today. So, why did these particular animals succeed as reliable dairy sources while pigs consistently didn't, despite pigs being domesticated just as early and just as thoroughly? Because domestication for dairy purposes was never random or purely opportunistic. Humans tended to favor animals that were manageable, reproduced reliably, lived comfortably in groups, ate relatively cheap and widely available food, and offered something genuinely useful without constantly trying to injure the person handling them on a daily basis. Cows score extremely well on nearly every one of those criteria. Goats and sheep score well too, which is exactly why goat and sheep dairies, while smaller than cattle operations, remain a legitimate and enduring part of global agriculture rather than a historical footnote. Pigs make excellent meat animals, arguably among the most efficient livestock at converting feed into edible calories that humans have ever domesticated, but they're consistently poor dairy candidates on almost every relevant metric. That distinction reveals something genuinely interesting about how domestication actually worked as a long-term human strategy. The animals humans chose to farm for milk weren't simply the animals producing the richest or most abundant milk in a laboratory sense. They were the animals offering the best overall combination of biology, temperament, and behavior for a working farmer to manage safely, day after day, for years at a stretch. A pig can technically produce milk, and produce it in respectable quantities relative to her own body size, but producing milk alone was never sufficient on its own. The animal also has to make that milk genuinely accessible on human terms, predictable, safe, and concentrated enough to be worth the effort. And that's exactly where pigs fail, spectacularly and consistently, across every single one of those requirements at once. It's also worth flagging some genuine complexity archaeologists and historians still debate here. Pigs were actually domesticated independently in at least two separate regions, roughly 10,500 years ago in the Near East, and separately in East Asia around the same general period, making them one of humanity's earliest domesticated animals overall, arriving on roughly the same broad timeline as cattle, goats, and sheep, rather than trailing behind them by any significant margin. Yet unlike cattle, goats, and sheep, which entered domestication as part of a broader Fertile Crescent package that quickly incorporated dairy use alongside meat, wool, hides, and draft labor, forming what archaeologists sometimes call a multi-purpose or secondary products revolution. Pigs were valued almost exclusively for meat from the very beginning and never really entered that broader, multi-purpose economy at all. Exactly why early farmers never seriously attempted pig dairying, whether it was purely the anatomical mismatch, the behavioral risk of handling a defensive sow at close range, or simply that cattle and goats already solved the dairy problem more efficiently before pigs got a fair trial, remains a genuinely open question among researchers studying early animal husbandry. The archaeological record shows intent through bone assemblages, settlement patterns, and butchery marks far more clearly than it ever shows the reasoning behind a choice that was never made in the first place, which means much of this explanation has to be reconstructed from anatomy and behavior observed in living pigs today, projected carefully backward onto animals that lived 10,000 years ago. Some agricultural historians have also pointed out that pigs, unlike cattle or goats, don't graze on open pasture the way ruminants do, and instead root through forest floors, garbage, and scraps, which meant early pig-keeping communities often didn't handle their pigs daily in the same close, routine way dairy farmers handled cows. Less frequent, less intimate contact with the animal may have made the entire idea of milking pigs considerably less obvious as a practical option in the first place. Even before anyone got close enough to discover just how briefly and unpredictably a sow actually lets her milk down. There's also a cultural dimension worth noting, and it compounds over generations in ways that make change even less likely. Once humans began associating specific animals with milk production, those traditions became deeply entrenched across different regions, passed down through recipes, religious customs, farming techniques, and even language itself. Cattle became dominant across much of Europe, so thoroughly that entire cuisines, from French cheesemaking to English clotted cream, built themselves around cattle milk specifically. Goats and sheep became central around the Mediterranean and parts of the Middle East, giving rise to feta, halloumi, and countless regional cheese traditions still made exactly the way they were centuries ago. In parts of Africa and Asia, communities built lasting traditions around cattle, camels, and other locally available animals, with some pastoralist groups in East Africa relying on cattle, blood, and milk together as dietary staples for many months of the year. People never needed access to every conceivable milk source available in their environment. They needed a small number of genuinely reliable ones that fit their climate, their landscape, and their existing knowledge. And once a community had firmly established one or two of those sources, there was very little practical incentive to experiment with something considerably harder to manage, especially an animal as unpredictable and potentially dangerous around its young as a nursing sow. Interestingly, the relationship between humans and pig milk hasn't run entirely in one direction throughout history, and this reversal is one of the stranger footnotes in the whole story. Anthropologists studying certain highland communities in Papua New Guinea have documented the reverse arrangement entirely. Women in some of these communities, where pigs hold enormous cultural, economic, and even ceremonial importance, have been recorded nursing orphaned or weak piglets directly at their own breast, treating them almost as additional children within the household for a period of time. These pigs, once raised this way, often remain deeply bonded to their human caretakers and are treated with genuine affection rather than as ordinary livestock. Rather than humans drinking pig milk, in these specific cultural contexts, humans were providing milk to pigs, a striking reminder that the relationship between people and this particular animal has taken some genuinely unexpected forms across different societies throughout history, even if none of those arrangements ever involved milking a sow for human consumption at any meaningful scale. It's a detail that flips the entire premise of this video on its head for a moment, and it's a useful reminder that human relationships with domesticated animals are rarely as simple or one-directional as they first appear from the outside. Now, picture a prehistoric farmer actually weighing the decision directly, rather than reading about it thousands of years later. There's a sow nearby with a fresh litter of piglets, alert, protective, and physically capable of causing real harm if approached the wrong way. You could spend the better part of an hour trying to wrestle a small, awkward amount of milk out of an anxious, defensive animal built around 15-second bursts spread across a dozen scattered teats, risking an actual injury in the process. Or you could walk a few steps over to your placid, cooperative cow and collect several liters in the time it takes to sit down on a stool and settle in. That decision was never particularly difficult, and it wasn't made once by one clever farmer who happened to figure it out first. It was made independently, over and over again, by countless households scattered across different continents and thousands of years of agricultural history, all arriving at the identical practical conclusion through nothing more than direct, repeated experience with the animals themselves. So why don't we drink pig milk? Not because it's biologically impossible, Not because it's inherently dangerous, and not because human bodies are somehow incapable of digesting it. We don't drink it because pigs are genuinely poor dairy animals from top to bottom, disqualified by their own anatomy and biology long before questions of taste or safety ever entered the conversation. Their bodies scatter milk across more than a dozen small outlets instead of concentrating it somewhere a person could easily reach. Their milk releases in unpredictable 15-second bursts, rather than flowing steadily on demand the way a cow's does for minutes at a time. Their large litters consume nearly everything their mothers produce in real time, leaving almost no usable surplus behind for a farmer to collect. And pigs remain far more economically valuable to humans as an efficient, fast-growing source of meat than they could ever realistically become as a dairy animal, a calculation that held true for early farmers just as firmly as it holds true for agricultural economists today. Cows, meanwhile, represent almost the exact opposite case. Easy to handle, easy to milk, built around one large and conveniently accessible udder, capable of producing enormous volumes relative to what a calf actually needs, calm enough to manage safely in herds, and able to keep producing milk reliably over and over again across months and years without ever needing to be slaughtered for the privilege. Humans didn't examine every mammal on the planet in some deliberate survey and arbitrarily settle on cattle as the winner. We tested what nature actually offered, animal by animal, region by region, across thousands of years of trial, error, and patient selective breeding, and cows, alongside goats and sheep, turned out to be among the best possible answers available, given the biological cards each species was dealt. The pig was never rejected because its milk was somehow inferior, unsafe, or unpleasant. It was rejected because the pig itself made a genuinely terrible dairy machine, anatomically mismatched to the entire idea from the very start, which is exactly why tomorrow morning, when you pour milk into your coffee, you almost certainly won't find yourself wondering why it didn't come from a pig. That particular animal has always had far more important business to attend to.